senior research scientist at Google Brain, and he's also an adjunct professor at Stanford. He has done a bunch of interesting work in robotics and multitask learning. So before Google, Karol was at USC, right, where he got his PhD. And today he is going to talk about multitask robotic reinforcement learning at scale. And it's an important problem. And as compared to supervised learning, where multitask and transfer learning work at least to an extent, in reinforcement learning, that situation is way more dismal. But I hope Karol will show us some light at the end of the tunnel. So super excited, Karol, and looking forward.
Great. Thank you, Pulkit. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. I've been following CSL seminar for a while. I've watched a few of the talks and I really enjoy them every time. So it's a big honor to be here. So thanks a lot. All right. So I want to talk about multitask robotic reinforcement learning at scale. So basically many robots doing many different things. And this is the work with many collaborators, mostly from Google. So I'm just the person talking about this, but this is the work of many people. All right, so if we were to look at the recipe that has worked in other fields in terms of modern machine learning methods so far, it might look something like this. We need a lot of data. So for instance, in computer vision, we need something on the scale of the ImageNet competition where we have a million of images. Or in natural language processing, we need large corpora of text, for example, all of Wikipedia. And then in addition to this, we need expressive, capable models that can utilize that data. So in the case of vision, traditionally, these have been convolutional neural nets. More recently, also other architectures, transformers, and so on. And in natural language processing, this is, I think, the most successful ones have been transformers. Now, this is a very kind of bird's eye view on how machine learning, modern machine learning kind of works. But let's kind of play along and let's take that recipe and see whether we could apply this to robotics. So we want to use the exact same recipe and just see whether whether we can apply it to robotics, and we can see what we can get. So in terms of expressive and capable models, that's relatively straightforward. All of these different subfields use very similar libraries. So it's relatively easy to take any model, any newest advancement that was done in, for instance, natural language processing, and apply it to robotics. However, when it comes to data, this is a little bit more problematic. In this case, we can't just go on the internet and scrape off all of Wikipedia. There is no data sets like this on the internet freely available to us for robots. And it's actually a little bit more nuanced than that. So if we look at some of the work in reinforcement learning applied for robotics that required a lot of data, for instance, this work from OpenAI on learning in-hand manipulation skills, it did require a lot of data and it learned this one particular task in this one particular environment. But I would argue that even if we double the size of that data set, it's not necessarily clear whether the performance would improve. We start to see that at a certain point, if we work in a narrow domain where we try to do a single task in a single environment, at some point we hit a certain plateau, and even doubling the size of the data set is not going to really bring us the benefits that we would hope for. However, if we made a similar argument for supervised learning fields, for instance, if we double the size of ImageNet, where we have many different categories of objects. Images are taken in all kinds of different real-world conditions, and there is a huge diversity in terms of what we see in the data set. If we were to double the size of the data set, we'll probably see a big benefit in terms of the final error that we see. So when I talk about a lot of data for robotics, it's not just the quantity of data. Here, I should be more precise, and what I really mean here is a diverse, multitask, high-quality data set that then, combined with expressive capable models, could maybe show us the benefits that other fields have seen as well. And here is a small plug. If you're interested in bigger data sets doing many different tasks in many different environments, I encourage you to check out MetaWorld. This is the open source version of 50 tasks that you can use however you'd like. We recently updated it, and it's just freely available to you, so please check it out. All right, end of the plug. Going back to the talk. So in this talk, I wanted to talk about two large-scale multitask reinforcement learning projects where we try to tackle these things and kind of see whether if we collect a big data set and then apply expressive capable models to it, if we can get something interesting out of it. In particular, I'll talk about two works. I'll first talk about the work that we call MTOpt, where we do multitask reinforcement learning at scale, where we first collect a data set with many robots doing many different tasks, and then we train a task condition reinforcement learning policy that can utilize that data. And then I'll talk about the follow-up work called Actionable Models, where we go beyond that and we scale this even further and we move beyond having tasks. All right, so let me start with MTOpt. So the goal of this project was to scale up the number of tasks such that we can amortize skill learning. So let me describe what I mean by this. So if we look at some of the works, for instance, the work that I already brought up, that requires a lot of data and learns a single task, or some other works that doesn't even use a simulator, collects all the data in the real world, but still requires approximately a year of experience in the real world, but still learns a single task. These are considerably quite inefficient ways of learning a single task, right? Like if we have to spend so many years of experience just to train a single thing, that's not really a great proposition. However, what I would like to argue is that sample complexity is not necessarily, the problem is not that it takes so long, but the problem is more so that it takes so long to learn only one task, right? So I would argue that if we could have our robots spend a year learning, and then at the end of that, they would be able to do all kinds of different things and help us at home and so on, that would be actually relatively okay. We would have robots that are fully capable, and a year that doesn't seem that long to achieve something like this. So we would like to amortize the cost of learning over many skills, such that the cost, while still high overall, would be relatively small per individual behavior. All right, so in order to do this, we build this system where we collect a lot of data over the course of over 1.5 years. And I'll talk a little bit more about how the data was collected and so on. But I first wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of how it works. So first, we need to start with a task definition. And here we make an assumption that a task can be defined by the final image in the episode. In particular, we can collect videos presenting potential failure outcomes of an episode. So here is a simple user interface where you can present what are the images that look like failures for that given task. We can also collect images that show the success of a given task. In this case, the task is to put something on the plate. Now, equipped with those videos, with those set of images, we can train a success detector that given an episode and the final image in the episode, it can take that final image and tell us whether the task was successful or not. This can be also trained using supervised learning, and it can be also a multitask supervised learning problem where we have a single success detector, and this is indeed what we do, where we have a single success detector that is conditioned on a task, and then given an episode, it tells us whether this task or any other task was successful or not. Now, equipped with that success detector, we can start collecting data on the real robots. Now, we collect data on 7 robots running more or less 24/7 with minimal human supervision. And as I said before, we'll talk a little bit more about what it takes to get it to such a operation and how to collect data for many different tasks at the same time in a way where it's scalable. Now, the episodes that are being collected are then being additionally labeled to improve our success detectors. So we would send these episodes and can constantly improve our success detectors so that they're the most up-to-date success detectors that we can get. This is really important because we collect that data over the course of over a year. So in that time frame, the seasons change, the lighting changes. We also move the robots twice. So we need to make sure the success detector always works. Now, equipped with the success detector and the episodes that we collected from the data collection, now we can start thinking about how we can train a single policy that is able to deal with that data. So we take the episodes, we label them using our success detector. Then we perform data sharing, where we share data across different tasks, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in a second. And then we take the entire data set and we train a single Q function that is trained similarly to our previous work in QTF. This is a continuous action Q learning. And this is a single policy that is conditioned on a task that can perform all of those tasks. Now, at the end of this,
a quick question, maybe.
Yeah.
So, are you interleaving the data collection by humans from the automatic data collection, or is it that initially you have negatives and positives, and then you let the robot run?
Right. So initially, for the failures and successes, that data is only used to train the success detector, but the robot always runs autonomously. We don't use any human demonstrations.
Okay. Okay.
So there is no need to interleave that, but we do interleave different versions of the policy with data collection. So basically, once we get our MDF policy, we deploy it onto the robots. We collect more data with that policy that results with more episodes, which are then being labeled for success detector. And then all of this is being used to train the new version of the policy, and then the new version of the policy gets deployed.
Yes. So I guess the question I was asking about interleaving was with respect to the success detector. So I guess you train the success detector initially, right, with some failures and successes, right? But then all the new data is being labeled by the success detector, right? But
right. So the new data is being labeled by humans as well.
I see. Okay. Okay.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a good question.
Okay.
All right. So then we get our MTF policy that is being deployed on the robots. Now, importantly, this is quite scalable, and all three of these components continually improve over time. So as we collect more data, more episodes are being labeled for our success detector, so the success detector gets better and better. With a better success detector and more data, we can train better and better policies, which then result in better data collection process, higher quality data, more successful data, and kind of each part of this pipeline keeps on improving. Right. So let's look a little bit more into details of some of these components. So first, autonomous data collection. Here, this is a little side note here that this is actually relatively tricky to get right. It's not maybe as fancy and scientific as some of the other parts, such as designing the algorithm and so on. But I would argue that this is one of the parts of this work that we are the most proud of, and it's actually really difficult to get right. And there's many considerations here and many simplifications that we had to make to make sure that the robots can run for this long. And it's really interesting to see what we can do to relax some of these assumptions. So we collected over 800,000 episodes on multiple robots doing multiple tasks. And they're running more or less 24/7 with minimal human supervision. It's also interesting to see what kind of failures you get once you run many robots over a long period of time with minimal human supervision, where we get all kinds of things, such as the robots breaking bins, throwing objects around, and things like that. So in order to make sure that we can collect data for such long period of time and with minimal human supervision, we had to introduce some simplifications. So first, in the bottom left corner, you can see our little motorized bin mechanism that allows us to do resets a little bit easier. So we can fully automate the reset mechanism, where we have objects in one bin, and we can either flip it back and forth to make sure that none of the objects is stuck in the bin, or we can just empty the bin if it's necessary. In addition to this, in the picture at the bottom to the right of it, you see that we have a constrained workspace. So we only allow the arm to move more or less within the bin region, the one depicted in blue, that allows us to basically make sure that we can operate safely. And we also, before we start operating the robots, we make sure we have a little calibration procedure where the robot can move around the bin to make sure it knows its boundaries. Now, in addition to this, we use simple tasks to bootstrap harder tasks. So initially, we would start with tasks that we're relatively good at, such as just picking anything. And then over time, as we collect more and more data with those tasks, we can use those to bootstrap some of the harder tasks, such as picking a specific object. For instance, picking a carrot is much harder and harder to learn than picking anything from the bin. But occasionally, as you pick anything from the bin, you would pick a carrot. And we use that quite a lot to collect data for harder tasks. And then as the harder tasks get better and better, we can start collecting data specifically for those harder tasks. In addition,
just to be clear, so over here, how are you defining different tasks? Are those putting different objects in the plate?
Right. So I'll talk a little bit more about the tasks that we have at the end. But basically, we kind of sat down and kind of thought of all kinds of different things you can do in a bin with objects. These are mostly things such as picking semantic objects, placing in different containers, realigning, things like that, sorting, things like that.
Okay.
Now, here, in addition, some tasks can serve as resets or initialization for other tasks. So, for instance, if we have a task just to pick something, and then we can have another task to place something that's already in the hand, we can use the first task to kind of initialize the placing skill that comes afterwards. We also took advantage of the fact that we can, instead of exploring for a long task, for instance, put 3 things on a plate, instead we can split it into shorter tasks, such as put one thing on the plate, and then stitch multiple of those together using Q-learning. So speaking of Q-learning, let me tell you a little bit more about how we train our MDF policy. So here's a little graphic showing how it works. So we collect an episode for a specific task. That episodes get labeled as either success or failure. But then in addition to that, we can impersonate or relabel that episode to any other task, right? So even if you were picking anything and you ended up picking a carrot, now not only you can use this episode for picking anything task, but you can also use it for picking a carrot as a successful example, but you can also use it as a failure for picking a cucumber, for instance, or placing a cloth somewhere. Now, it turns out that this is actually really important and quite subtle and difficult to get it right. So in this case, we compared to a few different baselines where we don't share data at all. So we only use data that was collected for a specific task, and we only use that for that task. We also compare it to sharing data across all the tasks. So every task gets relabeled to any other task. And both of these baselines are significantly worse than the method that we ended up coming up with at the end. So what we ended up doing here is using a little heuristic, which we call sharing data within the skill, where we heuristically assign certain tasks to belong to the same skill. So for instance, we can say that all the picking tasks, whether it's picking a specific objects or picking anything, they all belong to the same picking skill. And all the data can be shared within the skill category. So for instance, we can share data between picking carrots and picking cucumbers, but we can't really share data between picking carrots and placing cloth on a rack. In addition to this, we need to make sure that data is rebalanced. And here, it's not only rebalanced across tasks, but it's also rebalanced within a task in terms of successes and failures. And both of these rebalancing techniques were actually really important for the final performance. In terms of sharing data, this is a simple heuristic that we came up with that actually helped significantly. And more recently, we have a submission to NeurIPS showing how we can automate this a little bit further and use queue functions to help us relabel the episodes to other tasks. Also, to simplify our process, we train mostly offline, potentially with extra fine-tuning steps if we want to fine-tune to a specific task, which I'll talk about later as well. All right. So let me tell you a little bit more about the results. So at the end, we have a system that is capable of many different tasks in this bin setting, where we can deal with deformable objects and so on. We can do picking, placing, picking specific objects, placing in different places. We can do realigning, sorting, things like that, covering, chasing, all kinds of different simple manipulation skills. And one question that comes up is, how do we evaluate this? So in order to do this, we picked a set of 12 tasks that are picking and placing tasks, and we compared to all kinds of different baselines. So here I show the comparison to 3 other baselines where we show empty opt here in green. This is our system that is compared on the 12 tasks. Then in blue, we have the Qt opt multitask, which we refer to a setup where we share data, where we don't share data across any task. So we only use the data that was collected for a specific task, and we just still use a single policy to train on that, but data sharing is not existent. Then in red, we show data sharing multitask setup, where we share data across all of the different tasks. So every episode gets relabeled to any other task. And then we also compare to a single task baseline called Qt opt here in brown, where we are training a single policy. We are training a policy per task. So this is a single task policy. And we outperform those baselines, but I wanted to focus on one particular set of tasks that kind of gets across the point that I was trying to make at the very beginning. So here on the right, I'm showing, let me just give you a pointer. Here on the right, I'm showing how much data we collected per task. So here underneath, you see that plot. This is how many episodes we collected per task. And you can see, because of our data collection strategy, by a very large margin, we collected the most data for just picking anything. Because this is a skill that is really useful to do kind of any manipulation task afterwards. So we collect a lot of data for that. And for all the other tasks, we collect so little data that I have to additionally zoom in to show you how much data there is. And you can see that even between those tasks, there's quite a bit of an imbalance as to for what task, how much data we have per task. Now, if we compare our results and compare it to this plot right here, we can see that for the small data regime, where we don't have that much data for those specific tasks, that's where we see the biggest difference in performance, right? So it turns out that this initial assumption, talking about amortization of learning, seems to be true, that if we amortize if we can amortize that cost of learning across many different tasks, then for some tasks where we have very little data, they can benefit the most from that data sharing and parameter sharing that's learned in the neural network, because this is where we see kind of the biggest performance gap. So they can get to relatively high performance even though they use very little data. In addition to this, I wanted to show you a few qualitative examples of how MTF generalizes and how it works. So here's a task that we've never seen before, and we just threw a towel, a little kind of small cloth, and we asked the robot to cover that block, and it was able to do that. Here we also show how we can deal with deformable objects. These are these little toy noodles that we haven't seen before, and we can pick them up and put them in a ball. Here we can also align balls on the rack that we haven't seen before. And here is an example of a carrot picking task that we have trained for. And you can see some of the manipulation behaviors that it learned. So it can singulate the carrot, move other objects out of the way, and eventually get to that carrot and pick it up and put it in a container. It also shows a closed loop behavior. you have a mean experimenter, it will kind of keep chasing the ball until it gets it there. And then we can also remove the bin completely and instead put a bunch of blocks that we haven't seen before and have the robot learn how to stack one block onto others. Now, we can use that MTOps system not only to do all kinds of different tasks, but we also thought of it as potentially a good case for pre-training and further fine-tuning. So in this case, we took a task that we could already occasionally do, such as the task that I just described, which is picking a towel and covering a block with it. And then we collected 1 day worth of data to fine-tune to that task. So that task, the performance of it to begin with, since we haven't seen that before, was really low. I think this was single digits in terms of the success rate. But it's important that this initial policy was occasionally succeeding. So that was enough for us to bootstrap that learning process so that we can fine-tune it. Now, after 1 day of data collection, we were able to get to 92% in terms of towel picking and 79% success rate in terms of covering. So with just 1 day of data collection, we can basically solve the task with a deformable object that where we define the success detector just now. All right, so a few takeaways here. So we presented a multitask RL system that can learn many different manipulation tasks. It generalizes to novel tasks and environments, such as removing the bin, although the generalization, especially for the environments, is limited and it depends on the data that was collected. It can be also used as an effective pre-training mechanism, where as long as we have some initial successes that we can bootstrap off of, then we can use that to fine-tune to a new task relatively quickly. But there are still many remaining questions, such as how to do data sharing properly, or how to scale to more open-ended settings, especially in terms of data collection, where we don't necessarily want the robots to be operating in a constrained environment with an automated bin, but we want robots to operate in open environments where things such as safety and autonomy raise many more questions. All right, so this concludes the first part of the talk, where I wanted to tell you a little bit more about how we collect a big data set where the robots do many different tasks, and then how do we simply utilize that data set to learn a single multitask RL policy that can solve all of them. Are there any questions at this point?
Maybe a quick question. So in the results that you were showing, so on your slide you had lift any, where the multitask QT opt seem to be competitive to MT opt. Right, yeah. But on all the individual lifts, the multitask was much worse. So I'm a bit confused because I thought that lift any was the average across all the objects, right? So if the the multitask is performing worse for each object individually, then why does it do so much better when it is lift
right.
Any?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So the way that the data is counted here is lift any means that we're literally asking the robot to lift anything, and that was as long as you lift something, it's a success.
I see.
Now the way that we count data for lift, for instance, a bottle, is when we specifically ask to lift a bottle, and it's only successful if you lifted a bottle. It's not successful if you lifted something else. So it's a harder kind of semantic grasping task. Now you can see that a lot of the baselines do really well on that task, but that's because we have so much data for that task, right? So with the presence of so much data, it's relatively easy to train it.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from anyone else? No? Well, I would encourage everyone, to, make it interactive and ask Karol questions. And, of course, speakers find it lovely if you have your videos on. So, people who can switch on their videos, I highly encourage you to do so.
All right, I'm also happy to take questions at the end or in the meetings afterwards. All right, so let me talk about let me get to the second part of the talk, where I talk about actionable models, how we move beyond tasks. And this is something that was actually motivated by the first project. So as we were collecting data for all the different tasks in the MTL projects and training the policies, we kind of constantly were thinking about how we scale things up. So how do we collect more data? How do we train more tasks? How do we get better and bigger policies and so on? And one thing we realized is that at scale, the task definitions themselves become a bottleneck. It's not necessarily even the reward functions, which we can train relatively easily at scale with the, for instance, with the success detectors that I described. But I mean mostly just the tasks themselves. So we as the researchers have to sit down and kind of think what the robot should do or could do, and then think whether this is useful and whether it fits into our data collection process. And just thinking of these tasks becomes a bottleneck, especially if we want the robots that can do thousands and thousands of tasks and can do kind of anything in a given environment. It's really, really hard to think of those tasks. So one realization that we have, as similarly to many other people, is that one way of specifying the task is by specifying the goal state. Now, this kind of gets around this problem of task definitions, because then we don't have to sit down and think of different tasks and kind of specifying what it means to lift something or what it means to place it somewhere. But we can just take any data set, obtain rewards through hindsight relabeling, and just say that any goal that we've seen in the data set is a potential task. So the task now is potentially just a goal image that we specify, and we want the robot to get the environment to that goal state. So if we do that, one problem that we run into is we have this offline data set, and we have lots of images showing us examples of how to do things. And we can use that using hindsight relabeling to learn to show a Q function what to do to achieve that goal, because we have the trajectories that get us to the goal. But we don't really know how to show the Q function what not to do. Right? We don't know how to tell the robots, if you take a different action, that would not lead to that goal. So in order to do this, here we use some advancements from offline neural literature, in particular conservative Q learning, to create artificial negative examples to kind of also show our Q functions what not to do. And I'll tell a bit more about this in a second. Altogether, this combines in what we call an actionable model. This is the work led by Yevgen Chebotar. And here's a little graphic describing how it works. So we take an episode from our data set. We then look at all the images that we've seen in that episode. We add some artificial negatives to kind of regularize the Q function, so it knows that it's successful at some places, but it should be unsuccessful for other actions. And then we take all the subsequences of that episode, and we relabel the final image of that subsequence as the goal image, and then we throw this to train a single goal condition Q function. Right? So this is a little bit much to kind of go over in a single graphic like this. So we'll talk about all the different details in a second. Now, there's a few important observations from this work. So first, this allows us to train some kind of a model, actually, a world model of the world, but it's different than the world model that we are familiar with. So rather than training a model that takes a state and an action and predicts what the next state is going to be, we train a world model that is actionable. So it's a world model that is more discriminative than the first model that is more generative, where it takes state, action, and the goal, and then tells us whether that goal is achievable or not. Now, we can still take the entire data set. It's not really task specific. So it has a lot of the advantages that a world model and the dynamics model would have. But it's in addition to this, it's also actionable. So we can take that model, and we don't have to use things such as model predictive control or anything like this. We can just take that model directly and query it as to what actions to take to get to the goal that we want to. So it kind of encompasses this functional understanding of the world. It tells us which goals are achievable and in what way. It's also interesting because this dichotomy of model-based versus model-free methods is, I think, not really relevant here, right? It's we are training something that would be, by most people, considered a model-free learning method, reinforcement learning method, But actually what we get is something that looks very, very similar to a model and has all the same advantages and potentially more. Now, in addition to this, we could potentially use it as an unsupervised objective for robotics, similarly to many other unsupervised objectives that we see in supervised learning, for instance. Here we will show that we can use this not only to learn zero-shot visual tasks, where we can specify a goal image that we haven't seen before and try to see whether we can get to it, but we can also use it for downstream fine-tuning. But here, as opposed to the MTF work, we don't really require any reward functions or tasks. We can take any data set and completely unsupervised pre-train it using actionable models and then fine-tune it to a new task afterwards. All right, so let me tell you a little bit more how actionable models work. So we take an offline data set of robotic experience, and in this particular work, we took the data set that I just talked about, the data set that we collected with MTF, where we were collecting data from many different tasks. But we didn't collect any additional data with that data set. We just took it as it was and kind of train actionable models on it. So we take a data set of robotic experience, and here these little chains correspond to trajectories that we've seen in the data set. Now we can take these trajectories, and as we said before, we can do a simple relabeling where we set a goal as the final state in that trajectory, as well as we can take any subsequences of those trajectories and also mark those with the final image as the goal. Now, we can take the relabeled sequences, and now in addition to now knowing how to get to the goal, so our Q functions knowing what actions to take to get to a goal, we need to also somehow get across what not to do. So in addition to this, we add conservative action negatives, mark those as failures. So we sample additional actions and we would minimize the Q function for those actions. Let me tell you a little bit more how that works. So let's consider a little graph like this, a little tree like this, where we start we're at a certain state ST, and this is the state that we observed in our data set. And then there's an action that we observed in that state, action AT, that led to the next state, ST+1. Now, eventually, it will get us to some goal, ST+H, let's say, which is the final state in the trajectory that we observe, which is then relabeled as the goal. Now, what we want to say is, if we sample any other action that we haven't seen, our A tilde T, we want to say that this action will not get to the goal. So this is a conservative assumption. Let me talk a little bit more about this. So with offline hindsight relabeling, we only get positive examples. So we know that this action, that the actions that we actually have seen will, and extra actions that we've seen along the way, will eventually get us to the goal. Here we take this conservative assumption where we assume that there is no recovery when you take any other action. So if you deviate from the original action, you will not be able to get to a goal. So in this case, in this part of the tree, this seems to be correct, right? If we take some other action, that will eventually lead us to some other goal, G tilde. But if there is another action that, let's say, we took at ST+1 or AT+1 tilde action that we haven't observed, and even though potentially it's possible to recover and get to the goal G, we assume we make this conservative assumption where we say that we don't think that the recovery is possible. Right? So any action that you have not seen will be minimized. So we are saying that there's no recovery when you deviate from original actions. Now, we sample these negative actions such that they're contrastive. So in particular, we sample them according to the exponential distribution of the Q. So we want to take actions that our Q function at the time thinks that they're really good. So it thinks that it has really high Q value, and then we want to minimize those. Now, importantly, this no recovery assumption is actually not that bad, because if it's possible to actually recover, then we would see that the evidence of that in the data set at some other point. Right? We will see another trajectory which actually shows us that this A tilde T+1 actually eventually gets us to this goal, and we'll see the trajectory, and then we'll up the value of the Q function for that as well. So that recovery will happen if it's existent in the data set, but if it's not, we want to make a conservative assumption and say that it's not possible to get there. All right. So we minimize the Q function for those artificial negatives. Now we have a Q function that can get us to any goal that we've seen in those trajectories. Now we do one more trick, which we refer to as goal chaining, where we sample random goals from trajectories, and we also train our policies to get to those goals. So let me describe this a little bit. So here's an example that describes this. So let's say we have two different trajectories, one that starts at S0 and eventually gets us to Si, which is then being relabeled to GI. So this is one episode that we've experienced and that we've seen in our data set. Then let's say we have another trajectory that is in the data set that starts at Si and then eventually gets us to Sj, which is then being relabeled to a goal G. Now, we have two trajectories like this, and so far we've been training in all the subsequences of those trajectories. So we will be able to get from Si to Si plus 1, Si plus 2, and eventually to Sj. We also will be able to get from S0 to S1, S2, and eventually to Si. But we won't be able to get from S0 to Sj. We would be able to get there as long as we specify the goal that happens in between. So we can get from S0 to GI. If we specify goal GI, we should be able to get there because this was already trained on. And then once we're in Si, if we specify the goal to be Sj, we should be able to get there as well. But we don't really want to specify these goals in between. Right? We want to be able to start as S0, specify goal Sj, and go there directly. So this is what goal chaining helps us with. So what we do is we recondition our sequences on random goals which will enable us to chaining goals across episodes. So not only we relabel things in terms of subsequences within a single trajectory. So let's say here we have episode 1, here we have episode 2, as we talked about. So we don't only relabel within the episode, but we also would sample random states from the data set and just set those as goal states as well. Now, and the kind of nice thing about this is that because we are using Q-learning, which relies on dynamic programming, if we sample a goal for a specific trajectory that can be reached from the initial state, dynamic programming will propagate that information, and eventually we will be able to show that we can get from S0 to Sj. So in that case, we would take the trajectory, we'll condition it on a random goal, and let's say that goal is possible to chain. So this is the goal Sj, and what would happen is that the Q value starting at Si for goal Sj would be very high because this is actually reachable, and then that Q value that is high here will get propagated through dynamic programming eventually to S0, which would then result in S0 having a Q value that is high, that specifies that we can get to Sj directly. Now, if the state that we sampled is not possible, we will not get the evidence of that. So the Q value for Si for Sj tilde will be relatively low, and the Q value from S0 to Sj tilde will be low. Sorry, there was a question.
Yes, so there's a quick question. So dynamic programming, takes time to propagate information, right? So initially you might be making, incorrect judgments. For example, you cannot reach Sj from S0, right? And if I'm randomly sampling, most of my judgments could be incorrect, in the beginning. So would the conservative nature of learning, make you land in a bad minima which you cannot recover from? Or somehow it seems like that problem does not happen. So I'm wondering if there's some equation, why it does not happen.
Yeah, interesting question. So I think in expectation, once you kind of mulled over the entire data set many, many times, it should get to the right value eventually. It's possible that somewhere in the training, it's not the case, and it potentially gets stuck in a local minima like this. We haven't really observed that. We did see that like this chaining actually works, and because we are doing everything offline, we are not really bottlenecked by the number of gradient steps we take, right? We can kind of spend a week on training, and since we are not collecting any additional data, these assumptions that might be wrong in the middle of training will not really hurt us. So in that case, because everything is offline, it seems to be okay.
It's the power of just taking many gradient steps, so you kind of just converge instead of okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
And actually, we did a little test, and we look at the multitask, the MTF data set that I talked about. And there we had this structure where we would have a single episode for picking something, and then another episode for placing that thing. So now, if we did only relabeling within the episode, we would not be able to start from a state where we don't have anything in the grouper and just say place a carrot into a container, because this goal never existed for that state. But with goal chaining, and here is the example of this, when we evaluate on these pick and place tests, we can do that. So we can see a big difference when we allow goal chaining versus when we don't. All right, so now we see that we can relabel the sequences. We add additional conservative action negatives as failures. We additionally add random goals for goal chaining. And then we train a goal condition Q function to kind of take all of the data and train a single policy. That goal condition Q function is a relatively straightforward architecture, which is similar to the architecture that we used before for MTF. But in addition to having the image that goes as input, we also have an additional image that is the goal image that we want to get to, that we condition on. Everything else is the same. We didn't really spend much time on tuning that architecture. This is the architecture that was still used in the Qt paper that was published a few years ago. And then at the end, we get the Q value, and we do Q learning, goal condition Q learning in a distributed fashion to train it. So now that we have this goal condition Q function, as I said before, we can use it for two things. We can use it for goal reaching, and we can also use it for pre-training. So let's first see how well it works for goal reaching. So again, we use it on the data set that was collected with MTF, and we just see how well it does. So here are a few different tasks. Now, let me stop the video right here and tell you what's in it. So here we see, this is kind of the scene from a human point of view. And here on the right, can you see this? Yeah. Here on the right, we see what the robot sees. So this is the camera of the robot. And this is the goal image that we specified, right? So you can see that in the goal image, there is something in the robot's gripper, right? Versus here, it's not. Now, we can post hoc label some of these tasks and call some of them instance grasping. So for instance, you have to grasp a certain object, or rearranging something, or placing something in a container. And here are the success rates for those tasks if we kind of post hoc label them like this. Because so far we can only specify task with a goal image at this point. Oh, sorry, let me go back here. All right. So here's an example of how we can reach that goal image, right? So we picked something and we get to that goal image, and then the robot terminates. Here is grasping something else. Here we're grasping this carrot, and you can see that it tries to get to that goal image and kind of gets the arm even in the exact position. So we can try with many different objects. We can also try things such as placing something in a ball. And you can see that here the goal image is there is a hand above the ball and there is broccoli in it. So it eventually gets it and tries to get the hand to be exactly there. Here you can see a rearranging task where we are moving a banana close to a carrot and kind of picks it and tries to get it to the right position so that the difference between these images is as minimal as possible. And you can see how it tries to push it around and rearrange it so that the images are as close together as possible. Here you can also see another example of rearrangement. And let me move a little bit further. And here is an example of an object that we've never seen before. So here is a little spoon, and we want to arrange this spoon to be a little bit closer to the ball. And you can see that the robot kind of pushes it around, sometimes picks and places it so that it can get as close to the goal image as possible. And you can see that towards the end, it's actually really close. It's interesting because this kind of gets across this functional understanding of the world where we didn't necessarily see a plate or we didn't see a fork before, but it kind of understands how to get from one state to another and it tries to do it as much as it can. And here you can see some other unseen objects examples where it tries to deal with this cloth, and it takes a little bit, but eventually it kind of tries to cover the objects, and it almost gets there. All right, so these are some examples of what we can achieve by just specifying the goal you mentioned doing this goal-reaching task. But in addition to this, we can use it as pre-training and then fine-tuning for downstream tasks. Now, we did a few simulated ablations where we tried two different things. We either did pre-training using actionable models and then fine-tune it to a task that we had in mind, or we used actionable models as an auxiliary objective during training. Now, here are the curves compared to the baseline where we have no additional objectives. So in simulation, we can see that with pre-training, especially initially, we can see a big boost because we already learned a lot about how the world works. We extracted the right visual features and so on, and that helps a lot to learn this task much quicker. We also did real-world fine-tuning with a small amount of data, and here there was 3 tasks where we try it. And you can see that without any pre-training with that small amount of data, we get very, very low success rate on these 3 tasks. With pre-training, this is a significant boost in terms of the performance of those. All right, so a few takeaways. So this is with actionable models is a goal condition reinforcement learning method that removes the notion of a task, which makes it much easier to scale it to many tasks and many different data sets. It's an effective pre-training mechanism that can be used across datasets, tasks, and environments, which is quite important as we want to scale up our robot learning machinery. We don't really want to just collect datasets in a particular lab, doing a particular set of tasks, but we want to have methods that can take any dataset that was collected anywhere, and then use all of those for pre-training that can be then used to fine-tune to any particular robot or any particular setup. And then in addition to this, as I mentioned before, this model-free versus model-based dichotomy might be a little bit less relevant in this setting. All right, so in this talk, we talked about 2 large-scale multitask RL projects. MTOpt, where we collect a lot of data and we train a more traditional task condition multitask Q-learning policy that can solve all of them. And then we talked about actionable models where we can move beyond tasks. So going back to the very initial question that we had, whether we can use the same recipe that worked for other modern machine learning methods, but can we use it for robotics? In terms of a lot of diverse and multitask data and methods that can leverage that, I hope that we're starting to get towards the answers there. This is just some of the steps that we are taking towards that. But I believe that as we have methods that can work at scale, work with many different tasks, and potentially scale beyond tasks and beyond data sets, this is kind of the right direction to go to allow us to answer the question whether the same recipe that has worked for other fields will work for robotics. And this is it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Karol. That was a good talk. So we have a time for a few questions. Anyone? No one. So, maybe I can ask a speculative question. So Karol, so what do you think? So over here, all these tasks were, had this nature of pick and place. Although these tasks, are still very diverse. If we go by what is there in the literature, right? No one is really doing multitask learning in the way that you are showing. So, what do you think? If we start mixing, manipulation of deformable objects or some form of dexterous manipulation, will the same approaches scale? Or do you see any fundamental reason why or why not?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in terms of methods that are being used, I don't really see right now a fundamental reason why it wouldn't work. But I think that the really important reason why it's really difficult and kind of stop us from doing that in this line of work is that we need to collect data for those tasks, right? And to collect data at scale with many robots doing those, the whole setup needs to be robust and so on and safe. And that's kind of the main bottleneck and kind of a fundamental reason why this is really difficult. And I think there are two ways around it. One way is to kind of let the whole community collect those data sets with their robots, and setting up kind of their setup for every single task, and then using methods such as actionable models to then merge these data sets and learn one model that kind of can digest all of the data. And then the other way is to, which we are also exploring now, is how can we move the data collection to be possible in these more open-ended settings? So how can we move towards robots that can deal with some of these safety problems? And how can we even operationalize them in a way where we can collect data, where you can drop something, where you can break something, and it still doesn't really destroy the entire data collection process. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there, and it's quite exciting.
Yeah, I think just creating the right environment for data collection seems very challenging. Even we set assumption and all of those things. Cool. So I think we are at the hour. If there are no more questions, let's thank Karol. Oh, there is a question.
Yeah. Hi. So I'm wondering if it's an accurate, maybe slight summary to say that so the conservative conservative Q-learning style technique is preventing some sort of improvement over the data set, right? But the gold chaining is allowing us to have some sort of dynamic programming style improvement. So is kind of the main idea that we want to just only chain together states that we've actually seen the data set and kind of balance it that way with these two techniques?
Right. So I think with conservative Q-learning, even if it's, let's even say it's not in a goal condition setting, I think if we do conservative Q-learning with tasks and we even apply it to the MPL setting, you can still go beyond of what you've seen. So Q-learning has the ability to kind of stitch the data in ways that are better than what you collected, right? So it's kind of better than pure behavior cloning, for instance, in that regard, because it can improve over the performance that you've seen initially. Now with the goal chaining, this was a simplified graphic showing how if there's this chaining point that is exactly the same between the trajectories, then these will be chained. But it's not really how it works in practice with these deep learning methods and high dimensional neural networks, right? So it's possible we've never seen the exact same image covered by two different episodes. So it's a little bit blurry, this boundary as to where the goal chaining point is. And it seems that by sampling these goals randomly, we can eventually find some that seem to be good enough and allow us to chain trajectories that can be chained. And it sometimes makes these little leaps that allow us to chain trajectories even though they are not exactly compatible. And this seems to be good enough.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So let's thank Karol once more.
Thank you.